One moment, Sloan Ashworth was navigating the serpentine curves of Highway 287, the Rocky Mountains rising like ancient sentinels on either side. In the next moment, the dashboard erupted in a symphony of warning lights. The steering wheel stiffened beneath her grip. The acceleration pedal became meaningless, her foot pressing against dead weight. She had perhaps 3 seconds of momentum left, 3 seconds to guide the $100,000 machine toward the gravel shoulder before it surrendered completely to whatever malfunction had seized its electronic heart. The tires crunched against loose stone. The engine, if you could call the silent electric motor an engine, fell utterly silent. And then there was nothing but the October wind sweeping down from the peaks, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and the first whispers of approaching winter. Sloan sat motionless behind the wheel, her knuckles white against the leather. The irony was not lost on her. This morning she had commanded a boardroom of 40 executives, had decided the fate of a $200 million acquisition with a single nod of her head. This afternoon she could not make a car move. She checked her phone. One bar of signal flickered, vanished, returned, vanished again. The mountains were beautiful and utterly useless for cellular reception. She was somewhere between Bozeman and nowhere, surrounded by wilderness that did not care about her quarterly earnings or her Forbes profile or the empire she had built from nothing. The door opened with its characteristic whisper, and she stepped out onto the shoulder. Her Louboutin heels, red-soled, impractical, a small vanity she allowed herself, sank slightly into the gravel. The wind tugged at her Armani suit jacket, finding the gaps, reminding her that designer clothing was designed for climate-controlled offices, not mountain passes in October. She tried the phone again. Nothing. The call connected for half a second, long enough to hear her assistant's voice begin to form a syllable, and then silence. She might as well have been standing on the moon. For 5 minutes she attempted various combinations of walking in circles, holding the phone above her head and pressing the ignition button with increasing desperation. The Tesla remained a monument to her helplessness. She had conquered corporate boardrooms. She had outmaneuvered men twice her age with twice her experience. She had transformed a startup in her garage into a $3 billion technology company through sheer force of will and sleepless nights and the refusal to accept that anyone could stop her. But she could not fix a car. The sound of an engine reached her from somewhere down the mountain. Not the refined purr of a luxury vehicle, but something rougher, older, a working engine that had earned its growl through years of labor. She turned toward the sound and watched as a pickup truck crested the hill behind her. The truck was a Ford F-250, perhaps 20 years old. Its navy blue paint faded to something closer to gray in places. Rust had claimed territory along the wheel wells. The bed was cluttered with toolboxes and equipment that spoke of practical use rather than weekend adventures. It slowed as it approached, pulling onto the shoulder behind her Tesla with the ease of a vehicle that had stopped for stranded motorists before. The driver's door opened with a creak that suggested the hinges had stories to tell. He was tall. That was her first observation, tall and broad-shouldered, in the way of men who worked with their hands rather than keyboards. He wore a flannel shirt in blue and black, checked the sleeves rolled to reveal forearms that were tanned and scarred and strong. His jeans had faded at the knees from use, not fashion. His work boots were Red Wings. She noticed the kind that mechanics and construction workers swore by, and they were spotted with oil stains that no amount of cleaning would remove. His face was angular, weathered in a way that spoke of outdoor work and outdoor worry. There were lines around his eyes, not the lines of age, but the lines of someone who smiled often and squinted against the sun. His hair was dark brown, almost black, with threads of silver at the temples that seemed premature for a man who could not be much older than 40. And his eyes were brown, warm brown, like honey held up to afternoon light. They took in the Tesla, then took in her, then returned to the Tesla with the practiced assessment of someone who understood machines. His voice was deep and unhurried when he spoke, carrying the patience of a man who had never needed to rush through life. Car trouble, she heard herself respond, heard the unfamiliar note of helplessness in her own voice. It just stopped. I don't know what happened. It's only 8 months old. He was already moving toward the hood, and she noticed how he walked, confident, economical, each step purposeful. The gait of someone who had learned discipline, somewhere perhaps in the military, perhaps simply through years of hard work. He did not ask permission before opening the hood. He simply did it, leaning in to examine the machinery, with the focused attention of an expert. She found herself studying his hands as he worked. They were large hands roughened by labor, but they moved with surprising gentleness as they traced connections and checked components. There was something almost tender in the way he touched the machinery, as if he were communicating with it in a language she did not speak. His observation came without looking up. 12-volt auxiliary connection came loose. Happens sometimes with road vibration, though it's rare in newer vehicles. He straightened, moving back toward his truck. "I've got tools. Give me 5 minutes." She watched him rummage through one of the toolboxes, selecting what he needed with the certainty of long practice. When he returned, she found herself stepping closer, watching as his hands performed their work with methodical precision. There was something familiar about the way he moved, something in the set of his shoulders, the angle of his head when he concentrated. She could not place it, could not identify the source of the recognition that tugged at the edges of her consciousness, but it was there, a whisper of memory that refused to resolve into clarity. His voice broke her reverie. "Try it now." She slid into the driver's seat, pressed the button. The Tesla awakened instantly, its systems humming to life as if nothing had ever been wrong. The relief that flooded through her was disproportionate to the situation. She could have called for a tow, could have waited, could have solved this problem a dozen other ways. But there was something about standing helpless on a mountain road that had stripped away her usual composure. She stepped out of the car, already reaching for her purse. "Thank you. Let me pay you for your time." His hand rose a gentle dismissal. "No need. 5 minutes and a loose connection. It's nothing." "But you stopped. You helped me. Most people would have driven past." His response carried a simple truth that seemed foreign to her world. Anyone would have stopped. It's just what you do. She found her business card in her fingers before she consciously decided to offer it. "At least take this. If you ever need anything at all, please call me." He accepted the card, glanced at it. She watched his eyes move across the text, watched them widen slightly when they reached her title, CEO, Ashworth Technologies. His expression shifted, not to the impressed deference she usually received, but to something more distant, a wall going up behind those warm brown eyes. "I'm Sloan," she said, extending her hand. "Sloan Ashworth." His handshake was firm and brief, his palm warm and calloused against hers. Garrett Holloway." And then he smiled. It was a small smile, nothing dramatic, just a slight curve of his lips, a crinkling at the corners of his eyes. But it transformed his face entirely. Warmth radiated from that smile, genuine and unguarded, and utterly without agenda. It was the smile of someone who found goodness in small moments, who approached the world with an openness that she had long ago abandoned as a luxury she could not afford. She knew that smile. The recognition hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs. She had seen that smile before, 15 years ago in a different lifetime when she had been a different person entirely. He was already turning back toward his truck, offering a final pleasantry over his shoulder. "Drive safe. Road gets tricky further up." She stood frozen as he climbed into the cab, as the old Ford's engine coughed to life as he pulled back onto the highway and drove away. She watched his taillights grow smaller and smaller until they disappeared around a curve, and still she stood there, one hand pressed against her chest, as if she could slow her racing heart through pressure alone. Garrett Holloway. The name meant nothing. She had never known his last name, had never thought to ask, had been too overwhelmed by everything else to concern herself with such details. But that smile belonged to only one person in her memory. 15 years dissolved in an instant, and she was no longer Sloan Ashworth's CEO. She was Lainey again, 23 years old, 60 pounds lighter, because she could barely afford to eat, standing on the steps of the university library while 4 drunk students circled her like wolves. The memory came in fragments at first, then in a flood. She had been working late at the library, earning minimum wage shelving books and cleaning study rooms because her full scholarship covered tuition, but not food. It was October. She remembered the cold, the way her secondhand coat was not warm enough, the way she had been trying to calculate whether she could afford instant noodles and bus fare on the same day. They had appeared from nowhere, 4 young men whose names she never learned, their breath sour with alcohol, and their eyes bright with the cruelty that sometimes surfaced when privilege met vulnerability. They had surrounded her, blocking her path, making comments that started crude and escalated quickly. She had frozen, too afraid to run, too small to fight, trapped in a nightmare that felt inevitable. And then he had been there. He had materialized from the darkness like an answer to a prayer she had not consciously formed. Older than the typical student, broader, calmer, he had mentioned once that he was 25, had served a few years in the army before deciding to pursue his education. He had stepped between her and them without hesitation, without fear, his voice quiet but absolute. Walk away now. Something in his tone, in his stance, in the unwavering certainty of his presence, it had worked. The drunken men had hesitated, calculated, and chosen retreat. They had muttered obscenities as they left, but they had left. She had been shaking so badly she could barely stand. He had not touched her, had not presumed intimacy, had simply stood beside her and waited until her breathing slowed. His voice had been gentle when he finally spoke. I can walk you back to your dorm if you want. I'm Garrett. We have physics together. Professor Harrison's class. They had walked together through the cold night, and somehow they had ended up on a bench outside her dormitory, and somehow they had talked until dawn. She could not remember now what they had said, could not reconstruct the specific words, but she remembered how it had felt. For the first time in her life, her entire 23 years of foster homes and disappointments, in the constant ache of not belonging, she had felt seen. Not evaluated, not pitied, not used. Seen. She had told him things she had never told anyone. About the 7 foster families who had passed her along like an unwanted package. About the shame that lived in her bones, the constant fear that she was fundamentally unlovable. About her desperate dreams of building something, proving something, becoming someone who could not be discarded. And he had listened. Not the polite listening of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the deep listening of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. And when she had finally broken down, sobbed in front of a near stranger, for the first time in her adult life, he had not looked away or pulled back. He had simply held her hand and been present. When the sun rose, he had taken a photograph of her with an old Polaroid camera, capturing her tear-stained face in the golden light, capturing a moment she had never wanted to remember and never been able to forget. And then he had kissed her, softly, carefully, as if she were something precious that might shatter under rough handling. That kiss had been a promise. It had felt like the beginning of everything. But Monday came and he was not in class. Wednesday came and his seat remained empty. By Friday, she had gathered the courage to ask the registrar's office about the student named Garrett from Professor Harrison's physics class. The clerk's response had been perfunctory, indifferent. Garrett Holloway. He withdrew. Family emergency, I think. Left mid-semester. Gone. Without explanation. Without goodbye. Without any way to find him. She had looked, had asked everyone she could think of, had haunted the places where she remembered seeing him. But he had simply vanished, and eventually she had to accept that whatever had begun between them had ended before it truly started. The years that followed had been a blur of survival and reinvention. She had changed her name. Sloan sounded stronger than Laney, more appropriate for the person she was determined to become. She had graduated, started a company in her garage, worked 18-hour days until the dark circles under her eyes became permanent and success began to accumulate around her like armor. She had become someone important, someone powerful, someone who could never be discarded or overlooked again. But she had never forgotten that night, had never forgotten the boy with a man who had looked at her as if she mattered. And now she stood on a mountain road in Montana, staring at the curve where his truck had disappeared, and her hands were shaking as badly as they had 15 years ago. Garrett Holloway. She had found him. Or rather, chance had thrown him in her path, had staged an impossible coincidence on a random stretch of highway. And he had not recognized her. Had looked at her with the polite distance of a stranger helping. Another stranger had smiled his devastating smile without any flicker of memory. Of course, he did not recognize her. The Laney he had known was a ghost, a thin, frightened girl with dull brown hair, badly cut to save money, thick glasses because she could not afford contacts, wearing clothes from Goodwill that never quite fit. That Laney had ceased to exist long ago, replaced by Sloan Ashworth with her auburn hair and designer suits and the cold confidence of someone who had clawed her way to the top. She was not Laney anymore. She was not sure she even remembered how to be Laney. The tears came without warning, streaming down her face as she stood alone on the shoulder of an empty highway. She did not try to stop them. For the first time in years, in over a decade, she let herself cry without calculating the damage to her makeup without worrying about appearing weak. She cried for the girl she had been and the woman she had become and the impossible convergence that had just occurred. And when the tears finally slowed, she looked at the business card still clutched in her other hand. Holloway's Garage, Willow Creek, Montana. She could find him. She knew where he was. The question was whether she should. She drove to Bozeman on autopilot, barely registering the spectacular mountain scenery that surrounded her. The investor meeting that had brought her to Montana suddenly seemed irrelevant, a distant obligation that belonged to someone else's life. She checked into her hotel room, a suite that cost more per night than she had earned in a month at her library job, and immediately canceled her dinner meeting. Her assistant's concern filtered through the phone once she reached better reception. "Is everything all right, Ms. Ashworth?" "You never cancel." She found herself lying, something she rarely did. "Just feeling under the weather. We'll reschedule for next week." The suite was luxurious in the generic way of high-end hotels everywhere. Tasteful art-quality linens, a minibar stocked with items she would never consume. She ordered room service that she would not eat and drew a bath that she would not take. Instead, she sat on the enormous bed with her laptop and did something she had not done in years. She searched for someone from her past. Garrett Holloway, Willow Creek, Montana. The results appeared immediately. Holloway's Garage occupied a modest building on Main Street, according to its simple website. The photographs showed a clean, well-maintained shop with 2 service bays, nothing fancy but everything in its proper place. There was an image of Garrett standing in front of the garage, arms crossed, wearing the same flannel shirt she had seen today. He was smiling in the photograph, that smile, and looking at the camera with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. She studied the image until her eyes burned, zooming in on his face, searching for the changes that 15 years had wrought. He was older, obviously, the silver at his temples, the deeper lines around his eyes. But the essence of him remained. The kindness in his expression. The solidity of his presence. The sense that here was a man who knew exactly who he was and required no external validation. Facebook came next. His profile was public, unsurprising, for someone in a small town where everyone knew everyone. She scrolled through his posts with the intensity of a detective examining evidence, learning his life through the fragments he had chosen to share with the world. The first photograph that stopped her breath was of a child, a girl perhaps 7 or 8, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders and brown eyes that were unmistakably her father's. She was grinning at the camera, missing a front tooth, holding up what appeared to be a small rock, with the pride of an archaeologist displaying a major find. The caption read, "Molly says this is definitely a dinosaur bone. Who am I to argue with science?" More photographs followed. Molly at her first day of school, backpack shaped like a dinosaur, nearly as big as she was. Molly and her father at what appeared to be a camping site, both wearing ridiculous matching hats. Molly covered in flour in a kitchen, her father beside her in an equally flowery state, both laughing at some private joke. Molly asleep on a couch curled against her father's side while he read a book about, of course, dinosaurs. He was a father, a single father. It appeared there was no woman in any of the recent photographs, no mention of a wife or partner. Just Garrett and his daughter, and a life that looked small and ordinary and radiantly happy. She scrolled further, hungry for more information. Garrett with an older woman in what appeared to be a care facility. Mom's 68th birthday at Pinewood Haven. "Love you, Mom." A mother in a nursing home. Medical bills, probably. The kind of expenses that could devastate a family. Is this why he left school? She wondered. Was it his mother all along? The thought pierced something deep inside her. For 15 years, she had constructed a narrative in which Garrett had simply decided she was not worth pursuing, in which he had kissed her at dawn and then walked away without a backward glance, another man who had found her insufficient. She had used that narrative to build walls to justify her isolation, to convince herself that connections were liabilities and trust was weakness. But what if the narrative was wrong? What if he had left not because he wanted to, but because he had to? She closed the laptop with more force than necessary. This was madness. She was a CEO with a $3 billion company and responsibilities to thousands of employees. She could not afford to sit in a hotel room stalking a man she had known for one night 15 years ago. She had investor meetings and board reports and a flight back to Seattle in 3 days. And yet, when morning came and her alarm signaled the start of another meticulously scheduled day, She did not drive toward Bozeman and her waiting investors. She drove the opposite direction toward a small town called Willow Creek and a garage run by a man with warm brown eyes and a smile that haunted her dreams. She told herself it was simple courtesy, a proper thank you for roadside assistance, nothing more. But the lie rang hollow even inside her own head, and she did not bother defending it to herself as the miles disappeared beneath her wheels. Willow Creek announced itself with a weathered wooden sign and a population count that would have fit comfortably in the lobby of her Seattle headquarters. The town emerged from the Montana landscape like something from another era. Main Street wide and unhurried brick buildings that had stood for a century lining both sides pickup trucks angled into diagonal parking spaces. She had never been anywhere like this. Her childhood had been spent in institutional buildings and suburban tract homes, her adulthood in the glass and steel canyons of major cities. Small-town America existed for her only in movies and photographs, an abstraction rather than a reality. The Tesla drew stares as she drove slowly down Main Street, searching for the garage. A group of elderly men sitting outside what appeared to be a barbershop paused their conversation to track her progress. Two women emerging from a general store whispered to each other behind their hands. A teenage boy on a bicycle actually stopped pedaling to gawk, his mouth forming a perfect O of astonishment. She had never felt more conspicuous in her life. In Seattle, her car was merely expensive. Here it was extraterrestrial. Holloway's garage sat near the end of Main Street, sandwiched between a hardware store and a small diner with a hand-painted sign reading Donovan's. The building was modest, but well-maintained, two service bays with doors currently raised, the interior visible from the street. She could see figures moving inside, hear the distant clang of tools against metal. She parked across the street and did not move. What was she doing? What possible explanation could she offer for driving hours out of her way to visit a stranger who had changed her tire? She was Sloan Ashworth. She did not chase men. She did not make impulsive decisions based on ancient memories and impossible coincidences. 15 minutes passed. She watched the garage through her windshield, occasionally glimpsing Garrett's figure as he moved between vehicles. He was working on an old pickup truck, bent over its engine with the same focused attention he had given her Tesla. She should leave. She should drive back to Bozeman, conduct her investor meetings, fly home to Seattle, and file this entire episode under temporary insanity. That was the sensible course. That was what the person she had built herself into would do. But she was not moving, and when Garrett emerged from the service bay and looked across the street, when his eyes found her car and lingered there with obvious recognition, she knew she was not going to leave. He wiped his hands on a rag as he walked toward her, his expression curious, but not unwelcoming. She forced herself to open the door to step out into the crisp Montana morning to meet his approach with something resembling composure. His eyebrows rose slightly when he reached her. "Sloan, something wrong with the car." She heard herself speaking, heard the words tumbling out. "No, the car is fine, perfect actually. I wanted to thank you properly for yesterday." The paper bag in her hands when had she stopped to buy sandwiches suddenly seemed absurd. A peace offering from another world, deli sandwiches that probably cost more than most people in this town spent on a week's lunches. He noticed the bag, and his expression shifted to something she could not quite read. "You drove all the way from Bozeman to bring me lunch." The question contained a gentle skepticism, an invitation to explain what could not easily be explained. She had no good answer. The truth that she had spent the night stalking him on social media, that she was fairly certain he had saved her life 15 years ago, that she had never stopped thinking about him, was not something she could say to a stranger. Except he was not a stranger. That was the whole problem. One of the other mechanics appeared in the doorway of the garage, a man about Garrett's age with a baseball cap and a knowing grin. "Boss, you got a visitor, a fancy visitor." He stretched the word fancy into something that was not quite mockery, but was certainly commentary. A younger man joined him, equally amused. "She brought food, that's a first." Garrett's neck flushed slightly red. "Cody Travis, don't you have work to do?" The one called Cody's grin only widened. "We do. But this is more interesting." Garrett turned back to her, and she thought she detected a hint of embarrassment in his expression. "There's a diner next door. Better than standing on the street." Donovan's diner was small and warm, filled with the smell of coffee and bacon, and something sweet baking in an unseen kitchen. The decor was vintage Americana red vinyl booths, chrome-edged tables, photographs of the town's history lining the walls. It was the antithesis of every sleek, curated space she normally inhabited. An older man emerged from behind the counter as they entered. He was perhaps 63 with military short silver hair and a posture that suggested old discipline. His eyes were sharp, assessing, and they moved from Garrett to Sloane to the paper bag in her hands with obvious interest. His voice was gruff, but not unfriendly. "Been a while since you brought someone in, Garrett. A lady, no less." The words came with a certain weight, a history that she was not privy to. Garrett's tone held both affection and warning. "Walt, behave." The older man, Walt, was already placing 2 cups of black coffee on the nearest table, apparently having decided their order without consultation. "Black for you and for the lady?" She found herself responding automatically. "Black is fine." Walt's eyebrows rose in what appeared to be approval. "City woman who knows how to drink coffee. That's something." He disappeared back behind the counter, leaving them alone in the otherwise empty diner. The sandwiches remained in their bag, growing cold between them. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, grateful for something to hold, something to focus on, besides the impossibility of this situation. Garrett broke the silence, his voice level. "I looked you up last night, after you gave me your card." She felt her pulse quicken but kept her expression neutral. "And Forbes, Fortune, tech websites. You're kind of a big deal." He said it without emphasis, without the awe or calculation that usually accompanied such recognition. "Built a company from nothing. $3 billion now. They call you one of the most powerful women in technology." She did not know how to respond. The facts were accurate, but hearing them spoken in this context, in this small-town diner by this man with work-worn hands, felt surreal. His next words carried genuine curiosity. "So what are you really doing here? And don't say it's about lunch." The question hung between them, demanding honesty she was not sure she could provide. She set down her coffee cup, met his gaze directly. "Montana State, 15 years ago. Did you study there?" She watched the impact of her words hit him, watched his body go still, his coffee cup freeze halfway to his mouth. His eyes searched her face with sudden intensity, as if seeing her for the first time. His voice was careful. "Yes, for about a year and a half, before I had to leave." "Professor Harrison's physics class." "Yes." The word was almost a whisper now. "October, a night near the library. There were some drunk students." She did not get to finish. The diner door burst open with enough force to rattle the windows, and a small human tornado swept into the room. The child was perhaps 8 years old, with long, dark hair streaming behind her and a backpack shaped like a velociraptor bouncing on her shoulders. She made directly for Garrett with the single-minded determination of a heat-seeking missile. "Dad, Dad, Dad, you have to see this." Garrett caught her reflexively, lifting her onto his lap with the ease of long practice. His face had transformed entirely, the tension of their conversation replaced by pure, uncomplicated joy. The girl was already digging through her backpack, producing a small stone with theatrical flourish. "I found it at school. It's a fossil, maybe a dinosaur tooth." His expression became gravely serious as he examined the rock. Interesting formation. What's your professional opinion, Damali?" "I think it's from a velociraptor," the child pronounced with absolute certainty. "They lived in this area during the Cretaceous period. Actually, kiddo velociraptors were mostly found in Mongolia." The child's interruption was indignant. "Maybe one migrated. Animals migrate, Dad." She noticed Sloane for the first time turning in her father's lap to study this unexpected stranger with frank curiosity. "Hi, who are you? Are you Dad's friend? Do you like dinosaurs?" "I like velociraptors best because they're the smartest and they hunted in packs." The barrage of questions came without pause, without the self-consciousness that adults learn to mask their curiosity behind. It was refreshing and slightly overwhelming. She found herself smiling genuinely, not the practiced smile she deployed in business meetings. "I'm Sloane, and I think T-Rex is pretty impressive." The child's expression shifted to one of theatrical horror. "T-Rex, but their arms are so tiny they can't even scratch their nose." "Fair point, but they're still king of the dinosaurs." "Velociraptor could totally beat a T-Rex if they worked together as a team." The argument continued, and Sloane found herself genuinely engaged in debating prehistoric predator hierarchies with an 8-year-old. There was something pure about Molly's enthusiasm, her complete lack of pretense. She said exactly what she thought without calculation or agenda. The child suddenly leaned close to her father, stage whispering, in a volume that carried clearly across the table. "Dad, she's pretty. She has eyes like the lady in your old picture." Garrett's reaction was immediate and visible. His ears reddened, his posture stiffened, and his voice took on a note of forced casualness. "Molly, why don't you go wash your hands before lunch?" "But I want to up Molly." The child recognized the tone and obeyed, though not without a dramatic sigh that suggested she was being grievously wronged. Silence descended again. Sloan looked at Garrett, watching the color slowly fade from his face. "What picture?" He did not answer immediately. His hand went to his back pocket, an unconscious gesture she thought born of long habit. "It's nothing. Kids imagine things." Garrett. The use of his name seemed to anchor him. He met her eyes and she saw something there that she recognized, the fear of exposure, of vulnerability, of a secret being dragged into light. Slowly, reluctantly, he reached into his wallet. His fingers emerged holding a small photograph creased from years of handling, the colors faded but still visible. A Polaroid. A young woman with short brown hair and thick glasses and tear-stained cheeks caught in the golden light of dawn. Her own face, 15 years younger, stared back at her from his hand. "I've had this for 15 years, Garrett said quietly. "I've carried it every day since I left school. I've looked at it more times than I could count." Her throat constricted. She could not speak. "I looked for you." His voice cracked slightly. "After I had to leave, my mother had a car accident. She nearly died. I had no choice. I tried to come back. For 5 years, I drove to campus every year, asked everyone I could find. But you were gone. No one knew a girl named Lainey with gray-blue eyes. I changed my name." The words came out hoarse, barely audible. "After graduation, Lainey felt like someone who had been thrown away. I wanted to be someone new." "Sloan." He said it like he was learning it for the first time. "Sloan Ashworth." "But I was Lainey. I am Lainey. I was the girl on those steps." Molly chose that moment to return sliding into the booth beside her father with the unconscious grace of childhood. Her hands, still slightly damp from washing, immediately reached for the sandwich bag. "Can I have lunch? Now I'm starving." The tension broke. Garrett laughed, a real laugh full of relief and something that might have been wonder. Sloan found herself laughing too, though she was not entirely sure why. "Yes, Dr. Molly, you can have lunch." They ate together, the three of them, in a small diner in a small town in Montana, while the October sun streamed through the windows. Molly dominated the conversation with detailed explanations of various dinosaur species, their hunting patterns, their probable coloring based on recent scientific theories. Garrett listened with the patient attention of a man who had heard these lectures many times before and still found them fascinating. And Sloan found herself experiencing something she had not felt in longer than she could remember. She felt like she belonged somewhere. The feeling was dangerous. She knew this even as she surrendered to it. She had spent 15 years building a life predicated on self-sufficiency, on never needing anyone, on being so successful that no one could ever discard her again. And now, sitting in a vinyl booth eating a turkey sandwich while an 8-year-old explained the biomechanics of raptor claws, she felt all of that careful construction trembling. When lunch ended and Molly had been dispatched back to whatever afternoon activities awaited, Garrett walked Sloan to her car. The Tesla gleamed obscenely in the afternoon light, a monument to her success that suddenly felt like a barrier. "So," Garrett's voice was careful, "what happens now?" She did not have an answer. She had meetings in Bozeman, a company in Seattle, a life that did not include small-town mechanics and their dinosaur-obsessed daughters. She had responsibilities and obligations in a carefully constructed identity that left no room for whatever this was. But she also had 15 years of questions that had finally found their answers. 15 years of wondering what might have been if he had not vanished. 15 years of measuring every man she met against a memory that no one could match. "I don't know," she admitted. "I'm supposed to fly back to Seattle in a few days. I have meetings, board reports, a company that needs me." "Right." He nodded slowly. "You have a life." "I have a life," she repeated. "But I also have—" She trailed off, uncertain how to articulate the chaos inside her. He finished her sentence with something that might have been hope. "Questions." So many questions. And they stood in the autumn sunshine, two people who had once known each other intimately and were now strangers again trying to bridge a gap of 15 years with halting conversation and uncertain gestures. "I'll be here," he said finally. "I'm not going anywhere. If you want to come back, if you have time, I'll be here." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her fingers found her car keys, her body going through the motions of departure, while her mind remained fixed on the man standing before her. She was halfway into the driver's seat when his voice stopped her, Lainey. The sound of her old name in his voice was almost enough to undo her completely. "I never forgot you either. Not for a single day." She could not respond. She could only nod once firmly before closing the door and starting the engine. As she pulled away from the curb, she watched him in the rearview mirror, standing on the sidewalk outside his garage, watching her go, still holding the Polaroid photograph that had lived in his wallet for 15 years. The drive back toward Bozeman should have been an opportunity to think, to analyze, to create a plan of action, the way she approached any complex problem. But her mind refused to cooperate. It kept circling back to the same images: Garrett's smile, Molly's unguarded enthusiasm, the faded photograph of a girl she had tried so hard to leave behind. By the time she reached her hotel, she had made no decisions. She lay in the enormous bed, staring at the ceiling, watching shadows move across the plaster, and thought about a man who had carried her picture for 15 years. She thought about a child who needed a mother. She thought about a life that looked small from the outside and infinite from within. And she thought about the question that had haunted her since she had driven away from Willow Creek. Was it possible to be Sloan Ashworth and Lainey at the same time? Could she reclaim the parts of herself she had abandoned without losing everything she had built? The answers would not come that night. But as she finally drifted towards sleep, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she was going back. 2 weeks changed everything. She returned to Willow Creek 3 days after their lunch at Donovan's, telling herself she was only extending her business trip by a few days. The investor meetings in Bozeman had gone well enough. She was Sloan Ashworth after all, and she could negotiate billion-dollar deals in her sleep. But her mind had not been in those conference rooms. Her mind had been in a small town an hour away, with a man who carried her photograph in his wallet, and a child who argued passionately about dinosaur supremacy. The cabin she rented sat at the edge of town, a modest structure of weathered wood and wide windows that looked out toward the mountains. It was nothing like the spaces she normally inhabited. No marble countertops, no smart home systems, no concierge service. Just four walls, a stone fireplace, and a silence so profound she could hear her own heartbeat. She set up her laptop on the worn oak table and discovered something unexpected: she could work here. The video conferences proceeded without issue. The emails flowed, the decisions got made. The $3 billion company did not collapse because its CEO was operating from a cabin in Montana instead of a glass tower in Seattle. Becca's face filled her laptop screen during their first video call, concern evident in the furrow between her brows. "You're extending your trip again." She kept her voice carefully neutral. "I'm more productive here than I've been in months. No interruptions, no drama, just work." "Sloan, what's going on? You never take time away from the office. In 12 years, I've never seen you miss a Monday meeting." The truth caught in her throat. She was not ready to explain what she barely understood herself. "I'm fine, Becca. Better than fine. I just need some time." "Caldwell is asking questions. You know he's looking for any weakness he can exploit." Richard Caldwell, the name alone was enough to tighten something in her chest. He had been CEO before her, had built Ashworth Technologies from a regional player into a national presence. But he had also grown complacent, had made enemies on the board, had failed to see the digital transformation that was reshaping their industry. When she had proposed her vision for the company's future aggressive expansion into cloud services, strategic acquisitions, a complete reimagining of their product line, the board had chosen her over him. He had never forgiven her. 5 years later, he still sat on the board, still smiled his poisonous smile at quarterly meetings, still searched for the leverage that would restore him to power. Let Caldwell ask his questions. Our numbers speak for themselves. Just be careful, please. She promised to be careful, ended the call, and drove into town to meet Garrett for coffee. Their routine emerged organically over the following days. Mornings at Donovan's, where Walt would set down 2 cups of black coffee without being asked and pretend not to listen to their conversations. She learned the rhythms of the diner, which regulars sat, where what the specials were, on which days, how Walt's gruff exterior concealed a fierce loyalty to his community. She learned about Garrett, too. He arrived at the garage by 6 most mornings, worked until Molly got out of school, then devoted his afternoons to his daughter. His evenings after Molly's bedtime were spent on paperwork or reading or sitting on his porch watching the stars emerge. It was a small life by conventional measures, constrained and predictable, and yet there was a richness to it that she envied. One morning, watching him explain the intricacies of a transmission problem to Cody, while simultaneously answering Molly's questions about the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, she found herself asking, "Do you ever wish you'd finished your degree, gone into something more?" She trailed off, aware that any word she chose would be insulting. His answer carried no defensiveness. "I used to. When Mom first got hurt, I was angry about having to leave school. Felt like my life had been stolen from me." He wiped his hands on the ever-present rag, leaving dark streaks on the fabric. "But then I realized something. I was fixing cars because people needed their cars fixed. Every vehicle that came through these doors belonged to someone trying to get to work or take their kids to school or visit their mom in the hospital. I wasn't just fixing machines, I was keeping their lives moving forward." The words settled into her consciousness with unexpected weight. She had spent her career building something enormous, something that appeared in Forbes and Fortune and the Wall Street Journal. But had she ever thought about it the way Garrett thought about oil changes and brake repairs? Had she ever connected her work to actual human lives? After afternoons, she would appear at the small park near the elementary school where Molly would find her after class and immediately launch into detailed reports of the day's discoveries. The child's enthusiasm was inexhaustible. Everything was fascinating. Everything deserved investigation. Everything connected to everything else in ways that only Molly could perceive. "Cody says you're teaching my dad to smile again," Molly announced one afternoon, swinging her legs from the park bench while Sloane pretended to work on her laptop. "He says Dad hasn't smiled this much since before Mommy left." The mention of Molly's mother landed like a stone in still water. She had wondered about the absent woman, had noticed the careful way Garrett avoided the subject. "When did your mommy leave?" The child's response was matter of fact, the pain long since processed into simple history. "When I was really little, I don't remember her. Dad says she wasn't ready to be a mom, and that's okay because some people aren't ready for things." The acceptance in Molly's voice was heartbreaking. 8 years old, and she had already learned to accommodate abandonment, to forgive absence. The lesson resonated uncomfortably with her own history. "Your dad is right. Some people aren't ready." Molly's gaze turned thoughtful. "Are you ready to be a mom?" The question struck with physical force. She had not anticipated it, had no prepared response, could only sit in stunned silence while an 8-year-old waited for an answer to one of the most profound questions of human existence. I I don't know, sweetheart. I've never really thought about it." "You should think about it. You'd be good at it. You listen when I talk, and you don't tell me my ideas are silly, and you know all the dinosaur names even though you pretend you don't." She found herself laughing despite the emotion tightening her throat. "I do know the dinosaur names. You caught me." "See, you'd be a good mom. You just need practice." That evening, sitting on Garrett's porch while Molly did homework inside, she recounted the conversation. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that no Seattle skyline could match. His voice was careful when he spoke. "I should probably apologize for her. She says whatever comes into her head." "Don't apologize. She's honest. It's refreshing. She asks about you constantly, what you do, where you live, why your car is so quiet. I think she's planning your wedding already." The joke landed awkwardly, too close to topics neither of them had addressed directly. They had not discussed what this was, this tentative reconnection, this careful circling around the enormous thing that existed between them. They had not kissed since that dawn 15 years ago, had not defined their relationship, had not made any declarations that might require follow-through. She changed the subject. "You should tell me about your mother. Molly mentions visiting her grandmother sometimes." His expression shifted, the ease of the moment, giving way to something more complicated. "Mom's at Pinewood Haven, about 20 minutes from here. Parkinson's early stage. She was doing better for a while after the accident. She regained most of her mobility, but then the tremors started a few years ago. That's why you stayed, to take care of her." "There was no one else. Dad died when I was 15, heart attack, Very sudden. I was an only child. When she got hurt, I was all she had. The weight of that responsibility was evident in his voice. At 25, he had abandoned his education, his future, his chance at a different life because his mother needed him. He had never complained, never sought sympathy, had simply done what needed to be done. I'd like to meet her, if that's appropriate. His smile returned cautious but genuine. I'd like that too. She asks about you, you know. Molly told her all about the lady with the pretty eyes and the silent car. The following day, they drove together to Pinewood Haven. The facility was pleasant enough, clean and well-maintained, with gardens that would be beautiful in summer and a staff that seemed genuinely caring. But there was no escaping what it was, a place where people came when they could no longer care for themselves, a waiting room for the end of life. Evelyn Holloway sat in a wheelchair near a window, her gaze fixed on the mountains visible in the distance. The tremor in her hands was visible from across the room, a constant small motion that she could not control. But when she turned at their approach, her eyes were clear and sharp. So this is her. Evelyn's voice was stronger than expected, carrying the directness of someone who no longer had time for pleasantries. The woman who's had my son floating 3 inches off the ground for 2 weeks. She felt herself flush. Mrs. Holloway, it's an honor to meet you. Call me Evelyn. Mrs. Holloway makes me feel old. A pause. Older. Garrett pulled up chairs and they sat together while Evelyn conducted what could only be described as an interview. Where was she from? What did she do for work? Did she have family? What were her intentions regarding her son? The questions were blunt, occasionally intrusive, and exactly what any mother would ask about a potential partner for her child. She answered as honestly as she could, omitting only the more dramatic elements of her career. Evelyn did not need to know about board conflicts or corporate espionage. At some point, Garrett was summoned by a nurse to discuss his mother's medication schedule, leaving the two women alone. Evelyn's hand, trembling but determined, reached out to grasp hers. You love him. It was not a question. She started to protest, to offer qualifications and caveats, but Evelyn's gaze stopped her. I've been married twice. The first time was a disaster. The second time was the love of my life. I know what it looks like when someone's found their person. The older woman's grip tightened slightly. Are you going to hurt him? I don't want to. That's not the same thing. Evelyn's eyes were uncompromising. He's been hurt before. That woman who left, she nearly broke him. He put himself back together for Molly's sake, but there are cracks. If you're not sure about this, walk away now. Walk away before he falls any further. The warning echoed in her mind as they drove back to Willow Creek. Evelyn had articulated the fear she had been avoiding. She had the power to devastate this man, this child, this fragile family unit. And she had not yet decided whether she was willing to reshape her life to make room for them. Because that was the real question. Wasn't it? Not whether she wanted to be with Garrett. That answer had been clear since the moment he smiled at her on the mountain road. The question was whether she could be with him while remaining Sloan Ashworth, CEO of a $3 billion company. Whether the woman she had built herself into was compatible with the life he offered. She worked late that night, long after Garrett and Molly had gone to bed. The cabin was silent, except for the crackle of the fire she had learned to build and the distant hoot of an owl in the pines. Her laptop screen cast blue shadows across her face as she reviewed contracts and approved budget allocations and pretended that her heart was not splitting in two directions. The call came at 6 in the morning, shattering sleep she had only recently achieved. Becca's voice was strained with barely contained urgency. You need to get back to Seattle. Now. She sat up, instantly alert. What happened? Caldwell, he's called an emergency board meeting. He's demanding a vote of no confidence. The words landed like blows. On what grounds? He says you've been neglecting your responsibilities, that you've been spending company time on personal matters. A pause. He has photographs, Sloan. Someone has been following you. There are pictures of you in that town with a man at diners and parks and sitting on someone's porch. Her blood went cold. He's been having me surveilled. Apparently, he's presenting you as a CEO who's abandoned her post for a romantic fling. The board meeting is Friday. 4 days. She had 4 days to defend herself against a man who had been waiting 5 years for this opportunity. What's the board's temperature? Mixed. The numbers are still good, so some of them think Caldwell's overreaching, but others are uncomfortable with the optics. A CEO living in some tiny Montana town photographed with a man no one knows. It doesn't fit the image they expect. She was already calculating, already strategizing, the part of her brain that had built an empire clicking into gear. I need Nathan to start investigating Caldwell. There's no way this is just about me taking some time away. He's been too patient, too strategic. He has something bigger in play. Nathan's already on it. But Sloan, you need to be here, in person. You need to look like a CEO again, not like someone on an extended vacation. The conversation continued: logistics, strategy, the careful choreography of corporate warfare. But underneath the planning, a cold dread was spreading through her chest. She had to tell Garrett, had to explain that their cautious reconnection had made her vulnerable, had given her enemies ammunition, had potentially endangered everything she had spent 15 years building. She found him at the garage, already elbow deep in the engine of an old Chevy pickup. The morning light caught the silver at his temples, and for a moment she simply watched him work, the economy of his movements, the certainty of his hands, the quiet competence that characterized everything he did. He looked up at her approach, and his smile faded as he registered her expression. "What's wrong?" she told him. Caldwell's vendetta, the photographs, the emergency board meeting. She watched his face as she spoke, watched the light drain from his eyes. His response was quiet, contained. "So, someone's been following you." "Following both of us, apparently. They have pictures of us together. And now your job is at risk. Because of me. Because of Caldwell. He would have found something eventually. This just gave him an excuse." But Garrett was shaking his head, setting down his tools with deliberate precision. "You should go back to Seattle." "I am going back. Tonight. I have to prepare for the board meeting." "I don't mean for the meeting." His voice had changed, taken on an edge she had not heard before. "I mean permanently. You should go back to your life and stay there." The words struck like physical blows. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that this, whatever this is, was a mistake." He gestured between them, encompassing everything they had built over the past 2 weeks. "Look at us. You're a CEO with a $3 billion company. I'm a mechanic in a town that doesn't appear on most maps. Our worlds don't fit together, and pretending otherwise is just going to keep hurting you." "Garrett, 15 years ago I couldn't give you anything. I was a student with no money and a dying mother and nothing to offer. And you know what? Nothing has changed." His voice broke slightly on the last word. "I'm still that same guy, still in the same town, doing the same work, living the same small life. But you became someone. You built something incredible. And I'm an anchor dragging you down." The anger that surged through her was startling in its intensity. "Is that what you think? That I'm here because I feel sorry for you? Because I'm slumming it with the small-town mechanic? No, I think you're here because you're remembering something that happened 15 years ago and you're confusing nostalgia with reality. Don't tell me what I'm feeling. Then tell me. Tell me what this is." He was facing her now, his hands clenched at his sides. "Tell me how this works, how we build a life together when your life is in Seattle and mine is here. Tell me how you explain to your board that you're dating someone who doesn't have a college degree, who's never been to Europe, who thinks a fancy dinner is a steak at the diner instead of a burger." She had not thought about the practicalities, had not allowed herself to think about them. She had been living in a bubble of reconnection and hope, ignoring the vast gulf that separated their circumstances. "I don't care about any of that," she managed. "The world cares. Your board cares. Your shareholders care." Garrett's voice softened, the anger giving way to something sadder. "And eventually you'll care too. You'll wake up one day and look at me and wonder what you were thinking. You'll realize you gave up everything for a man who can't give you anything back. And I can't watch that happen. I can't be the reason you lose everything you've built." She felt the tears coming and did not try to stop them. This was Garrett at his most infuriating, so certain of his own unworthiness that he would rather destroy something beautiful than accept that he deserved it. "You want to know what I gave up?" Her voice cracked. "You want to know what I built? I built an empire, Garrett. I proved to everyone who ever threw me away that I was worth something. I accumulated money and power and influence, and you know what I discovered? None of it matters when you go home to an empty apartment every night. None of it matters when there's no one to share it with. He tried to interject, but she was not finished. I have everything the world says I should want. Everything that's supposed to make someone successful. But every night I walk into that penthouse and it's just me alone in all that space wondering if anyone would notice if I simply disappeared. That's what I built, Garrett. A monument to loneliness. A beautiful, expensive cage. Lainey, and then I found you again. You the first person who ever made me feel like I mattered, not because of what I could do, but because of who I was. You carried my picture for 15 years. Do you have any idea what that means to someone who spent their childhood being passed from family to family like an unwanted package? He did not answer, could not answer. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the war between what he believed about himself and what her words demanded. She pressed forward. I'm not asking you to be something you're not. I'm not asking for fancy dinners or European vacations. I'm asking for you. Just you. The man who stops for strangers on mountain roads. The man who wears princess crowns to tea parties. The man who talks to his daughter about dinosaurs like it's the most important subject in the world. What about your company, your board? I don't know yet. I haven't figured out the logistics. But I know one thing: I'm not going to let fear make this decision. Not yours and not mine. They stood in the morning light, separated by oil-stained concrete and years of self-protection. He wanted to believe her, she could see that. But the walls he had built around himself were thick, constructed from years of rejection and limitation. His voice was barely audible when he finally spoke. I need time to think. It was not the answer she wanted, but she understood the impulse had spent her own life making decisions and slowly, carefully, never committing until she was certain of the outcome. I have to go back to Seattle, fight for my company. I know. When I come back. If you come back. The correction was gentle but pointed. You might decide I'm not worth the trouble. You might win your fight and realize you don't need to complicate your life with someone like me. She wanted to argue, to protest, to swear eternal devotion. But she also understood that words were not what Garrett needed. He needed proof, needed time, needed the space to discover whether he could accept what she was offering. I'll come back, she promised, and we'll figure this out together. She left for the airport that afternoon, driving the familiar road toward Bozeman with a heart that felt split in two. Behind her, a small town and a man she was fairly certain she loved. Ahead of her, a battle for everything she had built. The Seattle skyline emerged through her airplane window as the sun set all glass and steel and vertical ambition. It was beautiful in its way, a monument to human achievement. But it looked different now, viewed through eyes that had spent 2 weeks watching mountains and stars. Becca met her at the airport, already holding a folder thick with documents. Nathan found something. Caldwell has been meeting secretly with executives from Meridian Corp. They're discussing an acquisition. Meridian wants to buy us. No, Caldwell wants to sell us to them. He's negotiating terms for a takeover with himself reinstalled as CEO. The treachery was breathtaking in its scope. Caldwell was not simply trying to oust her. He was trying to sell the company out from under its shareholders, enrich himself in the process, and eliminate the competition she represented. Do we have proof? Emails, recordings, a draft agreement he signed. Becca's smile was grim. Nathan has been very thorough. The next 3 days blurred into a whirlwind of preparation. She met with board members one by one, presenting the evidence of Caldwell's betrayal. She reviewed financial statements, assembled talking points, rehearsed responses to every possible accusation. She barely slept, barely ate, operated on reserves of determination that had carried her through every crisis of her career. At night, alone in her penthouse, she would check her phone for messages from Willow Creek. There were none. Garrett was processing, she told herself. He would reach out when he was ready. Molly called once using her father's phone. Are you coming back? Dad's been really quiet, and he keeps looking at his phone like he's waiting for it to ring. I think he misses you. The child's voice was like a lifeline thrown across the miles. I miss you too, sweetheart. Tell your dad I'm thinking about him. I told him he was being dumb. Walt agrees with me. She laughed despite herself. Walt said that. He said something about Dad needing to stop being a stubborn mule, but I'm not supposed to say the other word he used. Walt's reproach traveled through the phone line, delivered secondhand by an 8-year-old. Back in Willow Creek, she imagined the old soldier speaking his mind with characteristic bluntness, refusing to let Garrett wallow in self-doubt. "Tell Walt I said thank you, and tell your dad that I meant what I said." After they hung up, she sat in the darkness of her expensive apartment and thought about the people waiting for her in Montana. A child who collected rocks and argued about dinosaurs. A man who carried her photograph next to his heart. An old veteran who served coffee and unsolicited wisdom. A mother who asked the questions that mattered. They were her people now, or could be if she wanted them. The question was whether she could bridge the gap between who she had become and who they needed her to be. In Willow Creek, Garrett was learning the same lesson from a different angle. He worked longer hours than necessary, burying himself in brake jobs and oil changes because physical labor required less courage than emotional honesty. Cody and Travis exchanged glances but said nothing, recognizing the signs of a man working through something he could not articulate. Walt was less diplomatic. He appeared at the garage after closing, finding Garrett still underneath a vehicle that did not need more attention. "You planning to sleep under there?" Garrett slid out, wiping his hands on the rag that never seemed to leave his pocket. "Just finishing up." "Finishing up hiding, you mean?" Walt settled onto a work stool, moving with the deliberate care of a man whose joints protested sudden movements. "She's gone back to Seattle." "I know. She's fighting for her company, fighting for her career, doing exactly what you'd expect a woman like that to do when everything she's built is threatened." Garrett said nothing. Walt's voice sharpened. "And where are you sulking in a garage convincing yourself that you're not good enough, that she's better off without you? That love is something that happens to other people, people with money and degrees and lives bigger than Willow Creek. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. You're scared. Scared that she'll see who you really are and decide you're not enough. So you're pushing her away first, protecting yourself from a hurt that hasn't happened yet." The accuracy of the assessment stung. Garrett wanted to argue, to offer justifications, but Walt was not finished. A real man doesn't get measured by the money in his bank account or the title on his business card. Walt's voice carried the weight of decades of living. A real man gets measured by how he treats people who can't do anything for him. By whether he stands up when standing up is hard. By the courage to say yes to something even when saying no is safer. "She's a CEO. She moves in a world I can't even imagine. And she's choosing you anyway. Not because she has to, because she wants to. The question is whether you're brave enough to let her." The words lingered long after Walt left. Garrett locked up the garage, drove home, found Molly asleep with a book about velociraptors open on her chest. He tucked the blanket around her, removed the book, stood for a long moment watching his daughter breathe. Molly was the reason he had kept going after Diane left. Molly was the center around which his entire life revolved. And Molly, with the simple clarity of childhood, had already accepted Sloane as part of their world. He thought about his mother's words during the visit, how Evelyn had watched Sloane with knowing eyes, had asked questions that cut to the heart of things. His mother approved. His daughter adored her. Walt was practically shoving him out the door. Everyone saw what he was afraid to see, that this was real, and that his fear was the only thing standing in its way. He retrieved his phone from the kitchen counter, stared at the screen for a long time. He should call her, should tell her that he was sorry for pushing her away, that he understood now that he wanted to be the man she believed he could be. But the words would not come. The same paralysis that had stopped him 15 years ago, that had prevented him from fighting harder to find her after his mother's accident, gripped him now. He put the phone down. In Seattle, the night before the board meeting, Sloane stood at the window of her penthouse and looked out at the city she had conquered. Somewhere behind her, documents lay spread across her dining table, the evidence of Caldwell's betrayal, the financial reports that proved her leadership was sound, the arguments she would make tomorrow. She had done everything right. She had built something remarkable, from nothing, had proven every doubter wrong, had accumulated more success than anyone from her background had any right to expect. And yet she would trade it all for the porch in Willow Creek, for coffee at Donovan's, for a child's endless enthusiasm about dinosaurs. The realization was terrifying in its clarity. She had spent 15 years constructing an identity around achievement, around success, around proving her worth through accomplishment. Tomorrow she would fight to preserve that identity, would deploy every weapon in her arsenal to defeat the man who threatened it. But win or lose, she knew something now that she had not known before. She knew what she wanted, and it was not in Seattle. It was in a small town at the edge of the mountains with a man who did not know his own worth and a daughter who was already hers in every way that mattered. The board meeting loomed, the fight awaited. But beyond it, visible now like a light at the end of a tunnel, was the life she had spent 15 years avoiding and was finally ready to claim. She picked up her phone, typed a message to a man who might not answer, "I love you. I don't need you to say it back. I just needed you to know." She pressed send before she could second-guess herself. Across the mountains and the miles in a dark house in a small town, a phone buzzed once and fell silent. And a man who had spent his whole life believing he was not enough stared at 5 words on a screen and felt something break open in his chest. He did not reply that night, did not trust himself to find words adequate to the moment. But as he finally surrendered to sleep, he knew that something had shifted. Tomorrow she would fight her battle, and when she was done, he would find a way to be worthy of what she was offering, or die trying. The night before the board meeting, Garrett could not sleep. He lay in his bed staring at the same ceiling he had stared at for 20 years, the same room where he had grown up and returned to after his mother's accident and never left. The house was quiet around him. Molly asleep down the hall, the old pipes occasionally ticking as they cooled the wind brushing against the windows with the particular sound of Montana nights. Her message glowed in his memory like a brand, 5 words that had reordered his entire understanding of himself. "I love you. I don't need you to say it back. I just needed you to know." He had not replied, had stared at the phone for an hour composing and deleting responses, each one inadequate to the magnitude of what she had offered. She had made herself vulnerable, had reached across the distance he had created, had refused to let his fear become her silence. And he had given her nothing in return. The digital clock on his nightstand read 11:47 when he finally abandoned the pretense of rest. He pulled on jeans and a flannel shirt, moved through the dark house with the familiarity of long practice, and found himself on the porch where they had sat together so many times over the past weeks. The stars were brilliant tonight, scattered across the darkness like diamonds on black velvet. He had grown up under these stars, had learned their patterns from his father before the heart attack took him, had taught them to Molly when she was old enough to wonder about the lights in the sky. They were constant and reliable, these stars, unlike everything else in his life. He pulled out his phone, opened a browser, typed her name into the search field. The results were immediate and overwhelming. Ashworth Technologies board meeting scheduled for tomorrow. CEO faces vote of no confidence. Corporate drama unfolds as former CEO challenges successor. The headlines painted a picture of crisis, of a woman fighting for everything she had built. He scrolled through the articles, reading about accusations and counter-accusations, about anonymous sources, and leaked photographs about a board divided over leadership and direction. The photographs in question were reproduced in several outlets, grainy images of Sloan and himself at Donovan's in the park on this very porch. His face was clearly visible in some of them, labeled simply as an unknown man in the captions. The comments sections were worse. Strangers dissecting her personal life, questioning her judgment, using his existence as evidence of her unsuitability for leadership. They did not know him, did not know her, did not know anything about what existed between them, and yet they felt entitled to pass judgment, to reduce something profound to gossip and innuendo. He closed the browser, but the images remained burned into his mind. Tomorrow she would stand before 15 people who held her future in their hands. She would defend herself against accusations that were fundamentally about him, about the choice she had made to reconnect with someone from her past. And where would he be here in Willow Creek, hiding behind the excuse of distance and different worlds, letting her fight alone? The thought was intolerable. He went back inside, moving quietly so as not to wake Molly, and found a piece of paper and a pen. The note was brief, an explanation and an apology, and a promise addressed to whoever found it in the morning. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. Walt answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the late hour. "This better be important." "I need someone to watch Molly. I'm driving to Seattle." A pause, then with audible satisfaction. "About damn time, Margaret's on her way. It's almost midnight. She's been waiting by the door since 9, hoping you'd call. We had a bet. I said you'd figure it out by morning." She said midnight. Walt's gruff laugh traveled through the phone. "I owe her $10. 20 minutes later, Walt's wife arrived, a small woman with kind eyes in the same no-nonsense manner as her husband. She listened to his hurried instructions about Molly's routine, waved away his apologies for the inconvenience, and all but pushed him toward his truck. "That girl has been waiting 15 years for you to show some sense," Margaret said. "Don't keep her waiting any longer." The drive to Seattle was 700 miles of darkness and doubt. He pushed the old Ford hard, its engine growling protests at the sustained speed, the headlights carving tunnels through the night. The roads were empty at this hour, truckers and insomniacs and apparently mechanics on missions of desperate romantic redemption. He played the radio for a while, then turned it off. He rehearsed what he might say, then abandoned the rehearsals. He thought about everything that had brought him to this moment, the night he had met Lainey, the morning he had left, the 15 years of wondering, the impossible coincidence of a broken-down Tesla on a mountain road. And he thought about Molly, his daughter who had accepted Sloan without hesitation, who had already begun to imagine her as part of their family. Molly deserved to see her father fight for something, to learn that love was worth courage even when courage was terrifying. The miles accumulated beneath his wheels. Montana gave way to Idaho to Washington, darkness to the first gray hints of dawn. He stopped once for gas and coffee, consumed both without really tasting them, and continued west toward the rising sun. By the time the Seattle skyline emerged from the morning haze, he had been driving for nearly 13 hours. His eyes burned, his back ached, and his shirt, the nicest one he owned, the one he wore to church on the rare occasions he attended, was wrinkled beyond repair. He looked like a man who had driven through the night because he had, and there was no time to fix it. The Ashworth Technologies headquarters occupied a tower of glass and steel in the heart of the city's business district. He found parking, an undertaking that cost him 30 minutes and a small fortune, and stood on the sidewalk looking up at the building that represented everything Sloan had achieved. It was intimidating. He had known it would be, had prepared himself for the scale and the sophistication. But the reality exceeded his expectations. This was her world, a world of security guards and executive elevators and conference rooms that probably cost more to furnish than his entire house. He did not belong here. Every instinct told him to turn around, to acknowledge that his grand gesture was foolish, to accept that some gaps were too wide to bridge. But he thought of her message, of 5 words sent across the miles, asking nothing in return. He walked into the lobby. The security desk presented the first obstacle. A uniformed guard regarded him with barely concealed skepticism, taking in his worn jeans and wrinkled shirt and the general appearance of someone who had been living in a truck for half a day. "Can I help you?" "I'm here for the board meeting, Ashworth Technologies." "Name, Garrett Holloway." The guard consulted his tablet, scrolled through a list, frowned. "I don't have you on the approved list for the 48th floor." "I'm not on the list, but I need to get up there." "Sir, I can't admit anyone without authorization." He leaned forward, keeping his voice low but urgent. "The CEO is about to face a vote that could end her career. I have information relevant to that vote. If you stop me and she loses because of it, how do you think that's going to play out for you?" It was a bluff, and not a particularly good one. But something in his expression must have conveyed sincerity, because the guard hesitated. "Let me make a call." The call went to someone who called someone else who apparently had the authority to make decisions. 10 minutes later, 10 minutes during which Garrett paced the lobby like a caged animal, checking his phone for the time. Every 30 seconds, the guard returned with a visitor badge. 48th floor. "But sir, you might want to." He gestured vaguely at Garrett's appearance. "I know. Trust me, I know." The elevator ride felt endless. 48 floors of polished brass and soft music carrying him toward a confrontation he had not planned and could not predict. He watched the numbers climb and thought about everything he wanted to say, and knew that when the moment came, he would probably forget all of it. The doors opened onto a reception area of muted elegance. A woman behind a desk looked up at his approach, and her expression suggested she had been warned about his arrival. "The meeting is in the main conference room. Down the hall, last door on the left." A pause. "They've already started." He thanked her and walked. The hallway stretched before him like a gauntlet, lined with abstract art and framed awards and photographs of corporate milestones. At the end, double doors of frosted glass stood slightly ajar, and through them he could hear voices, a man speaking, his tone dripping with false concern. "And these photographs demonstrate a pattern of neglect that cannot be ignored." Our CEO has chosen to prioritize personal matters over her fiduciary responsibilities. Caldwell. Garrett recognized the type even without seeing the face, the smooth delivery, the careful framing, the knife concealed behind reasonable words. He had known men like this in the Army, had watched them sacrifice others for their own advancement, had learned to identify the particular brand of ambition that masqueraded as principle. He pushed open the doors. The conference room fell silent. 15 faces turned toward him, mostly older, mostly male, wearing expressions that ranged from confusion to irritation at the interruption. At the head of the table stood a silver-haired man in an expensive suit, his presentation frozen on the screen behind him. This would be Caldwell, and there at the opposite end was Sloane. She looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and the tension in her shoulders suggested she had not slept much better than he had. But when she saw him, when recognition and surprise and something that might have been hope flickered across her face, he knew he had made the right choice. "I'm sorry for interrupting," he heard himself say, "but I have something to say, and I think this board needs to hear it." Caldwell recovered first, his voice sharp with indignation. "This is a closed meeting. Security should never have let him speak." This from a woman on the board, perhaps 65, with steel-gray hair and an expression that brooked no argument. "I'd like to hear what he has to say." Garrett stepped further into the room, acutely aware of every eye upon him. He had navigated bureaucracies and broken machinery and the thousand small crises of running a business. But this was different. This was fighting for something that mattered more than any contract or quarterly report. "My name is Garrett Holloway. I'm the man in those photographs you've been looking at." He gestured towards the screen where an image of him and Sloane at Donovan's was still displayed. "I'm a mechanic from a small town in Montana. I don't have a college degree. I've never been in a boardroom like this in my life. By every measure you probably use to evaluate people, I'm nobody." He paused, letting the admission settle. "But I know Sloane Ashworth. Not the CEO, though that version of her is remarkable too. I know the woman beneath the title. I know how she wakes before dawn because she can't stop thinking about ways to improve her company. I know how she remembers names, how she asks about people's families, how she treats the lowest level employee with the same respect she gives her board of directors." Caldwell attempted to interrupt. "This is highly irregular. 15 years ago." Garrett continued, ignoring him. "I met her when she was a college student with nothing but determination and a dream. She was working 3 jobs to afford food because her scholarship didn't cover everything. She came from the foster care system, 7 families in 18 years, none of them wanting her permanently. She had every reason to give up, to accept that the world had decided she wasn't worth keeping." He looked directly at Sloane, now speaking to her as much as to the board. "But she didn't give up. She built something extraordinary. She took a company that was stagnating under its previous leadership," a pointed glance at Caldwell, "and transformed it into what it is today. The numbers prove it. The market cap proves it. The loyalty of thousands of employees proves it." "Mr. Holloway," Caldwell's voice had grown tight with barely concealed fury. "I'm not finished." Garrett turned to face him directly. "You want to talk about neglect? About a CEO who doesn't have the company's best interests at heart? Maybe we should talk about your meetings with Meridian Corp. Maybe we should talk about the acquisition you have been negotiating behind this board's back. The one that would make you CEO again while selling out every shareholder in this room." The accusation landed like a bomb. Board members exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from skepticism to sharp attention. "That's a serious allegation," the gray-haired woman said. "It's documented." Garrett looked toward Sloane. "Your legal team has the evidence, emails, recordings, a draft agreement. Mr. Caldwell isn't trying to save this company. He's trying to sell it out from under you." The meeting erupted. Questions flew across the table, demands for evidence, accusations of fabrication, calls for order. Caldwell's face had gone pale, his smooth composure finally cracking. Sloane stood, her voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of someone who had earned her position. "Nathan, please distribute the documentation." A man Garrett had not noticed, presumably the company's legal counsel, began passing folders around the table. The room fell silent as board members opened the evidence, their expressions darkening as they read. When the gray-haired woman looked up, her voice was cold. "Richard, what do you have to say about this?" Caldwell's attempt at denial was weak. His explanations tangled his composure. dissolving under the weight of documented betrayal. The board watched with the merciless attention of people who had nearly been deceived, who were now reassessing everything they had believed. The vote when it came was swift and decisive. 14 in favor of retaining Sloan as CEO, one against Caldwell himself in a final act of defiance. Then came the second vote, the one that mattered almost as much. Richard Caldwell was asked to resign from the board, effective immediately pending a full investigation into his negotiations with Meridian. He left without speaking, his expensive suit somehow looking cheaper than it had when the meeting began. The room began to clear. Board members approached Sloan with congratulations and apologies, with promises of continued support and awkward acknowledgments that they should have trusted her more. She accepted their words with grace, but her eyes kept finding Garrett across the room. Finally, only the two of them remained. She walked toward him slowly, as if afraid he might disappear. When she was close enough to touch, she stopped. "You drove 14 hours. 13 and a half, actually. There wasn't much traffic. You came to my board meeting. You stood up in front of 15 people you've never met and defended me. I'm tired of watching you fight alone. I'm tired of telling myself I'm not enough. Maybe I'm not. Maybe you'll wake up someday and wonder what you were thinking, but at least I'll know I tried. At least I won't spend another 15 years wondering what might have happened if I'd shown up." She reached out, touched his cheek, traced the line of his jaw with fingers that trembled slightly. "You showed up. I should have done it sooner. I should have texted you back. I should have." She kissed him. There in the conference room of a Fortune 500 company, surrounded by leather chairs and corporate art with the Seattle skyline glittering through the windows, she kissed him with 15 years of longing, compressed into a single moment. When they finally separated, she was crying. He was fairly certain he was too. "You're exhausted," she said. "When did you last sleep?" "I don't remember. Sometime yesterday, maybe." "There's a couch in my office. You should rest." "I should call Molly. She'll be worried." "Call her from my office, then sleep. We have time now." They did have time. That was the miracle of it. After all the years of separation, after the weeks of uncertainty, after the battle just concluded, they finally had time. 3 months later, the world looked different. Sloan had restructured her role at Ashworth Technologies, working with Becca to establish a co-CEO arrangement that gave her more flexibility without sacrificing oversight. She spent 3 days each week in Seattle handling major decisions and strategic planning. The other 4 days, she worked from the cabin in Willowquay Creek that had become more home than her penthouse had ever been. The arrangement had required adjustment. Board members had initially been skeptical, accustomed to CEOs who lived in their offices. But the results spoke for themselves. Productivity remained high, morale improved with the example of work-life balance at the top, and the company continued its trajectory of growth. Garrett's life had transformed as well. With Sloan's business advice, not her money, which he refused on principle, Holloway's garage had expanded. He hired 2 additional mechanics, invested in diagnostic equipment that let him handle more complex repairs, and began servicing fleet vehicles for local businesses. The shop that had been barely surviving was now genuinely thriving. But the biggest change was not professional. It was personal, intimate, woven into the fabric of daily life. Molly had accepted Sloan completely. The child now had someone to discuss dinosaurs with who actually remembered the scientific names, someone who helped with homework and attended school events, and listened with genuine interest to the endless stream of observations and questions that poured from her 8-year-old mind. They were a family, not officially, not legally, but in every way that mattered. 3 people who had found each other against impossible odds and were building something together. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains golden rose, Molly asked the question she had been saving. "Miss Laney, when are you going to move in with us for real? You already have a toothbrush in the bathroom." Garrett nearly choked on his beer. Sloan managed to keep her composure, but barely. "That's something your dad and I are still figuring out, sweetheart. Why you're here all the time anyway. And Dad smiles more when you're around. He even whistles now. He never used to whistle." The observation landed with unexpected force. Garrett had not realized his happiness was so visible, so quantifiable in changed habits and involuntary sounds. Sloan caught his eye, her expression soft. "What do you think? Am I here too much?" Not enough, he heard himself say. You could never be here enough. Molly threw her hands in the air with theatrical exasperation. Then just get married already, everyone knows you're going to. Walt has a pool going at the diner. A pool. He says most people think it'll happen before Christmas, but Mrs. Henderson says Valentine's Day because she's romantic. Garrett made a mental note to have words with Walt about corrupting his daughter with gambling discussions. But the seed had been planted, and as weeks turned into months, as the life they were building together grew more solid and more natural, the question of the future began to press more urgently. 1 year after that first board meeting on an October evening, almost exactly matching the weather of their original meeting on the mountain road, Garrett made his preparations. The ring had belonged to his grandmother, a simple band of yellow gold with a small sapphire that matched the color of Montana's evening sky. His grandfather had given it to her in 1952, and she had worn it for 52 years until his death. Before she passed, she had pressed it into Garrett's hand with instructions that allowed no argument. Give this to the woman you want to spend your life with, not the woman you think you should want or the woman other people expect, the one you can't imagine living without. He had kept it in his sock drawer for years, waiting for a person who had never appeared. Now finally he knew who it belonged to. The occasion was Molly's final soccer game of the season. His daughter had no natural athletic talent. Her interests ran more toward rocks and stars than balls and goals. But she had joined the team because her friends had, and she approached each game with cheerful indifference to the actual score. Sloane sat beside him on the bleachers, watching Molly chase a butterfly near the corner flag while the game continued around her. She's going to get hit by the ball, Sloane observed. Probably. Happens at least once per game. As if on cue, the soccer ball careened toward Molly's position. She turned at the last moment that the ball struck. Her shoulder ricocheted into the goal. The referee blew his whistle. Somehow, against all logic, Molly had scored. She looked up at the bleachers with an expression of profound confusion, then spotted her father and Sloane and began waving frantically. They stood and cheered as if she had won the World Cup, as if this accidental goal was the greatest athletic achievement in human history. Later, after the game, after the celebratory ice cream, after Molly had exhausted herself recounting the story of her amazing goal for the 14th time and fallen asleep on the couch, Garrett led Sloane out to the porch. The stars were emerging, the same stars that had witnessed their first conversations, the same stars under which he had wrestled with his fears and finally found the courage to drive through the night. The air carried the first bite of approaching winter, but neither of them felt the cold. 1 year ago, he began, I drove 14 hours to stand up in a boardroom full of strangers and defend you. 13 and a half, you keep rounding up. Fine, 13 and a half hours. He smiled despite himself. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what I was going to say. I just knew I couldn't let you face that alone. She reached for his hand. You didn't have to. I did. I spent 15 years wondering what would have happened if I tried harder to find you after Mom's accident. I wasn't going to spend another 15 years wondering what would have happened if I'd stayed in Willow Creek while your career collapsed. The ring was in his pocket, the small velvet box pressing against his thigh. He had rehearsed this moment 100 times in his head, but now that it had arrived, the words he had prepared seemed inadequate. Lainey, he said, using the name that was hers alone. When I was 25, I was a broke college student with nothing to offer you. Now I'm a 40-year-old mechanic who's still basically broke with oil under his fingernails, and a daughter who can't stop talking about dinosaurs, and a mother in a nursing home that I visit every Sunday. Garrett, let me finish, please. He took a breath. I don't have an MBA. I've never been to Europe. My idea of a fancy dinner is ordering appetizers along with the main course. By every standard the world uses to measure success, I'm nobody. I'm the guy who fixes cars and coaches youth soccer and falls asleep during movies. He reached into his pocket, withdrew the box, opened it. The sapphire caught the starlight and seemed to glow from within. But I love you. I've loved you since I was 25 years old, sitting on a bench outside your dormitory, watching the sun come up, realizing I'd never met anyone like you. I loved you through 15 years of not knowing where you were or if I'd ever see you again. And I love you now, standing here with the oil stains on my jeans and probably something in my teeth from that ice cream, offering you a ring that's been in my family for 70 years. She was crying. He pressed on anyway. I know I'm not what your board expects. I know I'm not what the world thinks you deserve. But I promise you this, every single day, for the rest of my life, I will work to be worthy of you. I will support your dreams. I will celebrate your victories. I will hold you through your defeats. I will never ever leave without saying goodbye. He knelt because that was what you did in this moment, because some traditions mattered even when everything else was unconventional. Sloan Ashworth Laney, will you marry me? The silence stretched for what felt like years. He watched her face, saw the emotions cycling through shock. Joy, fear, love, more joy. Saw her look at the ring, at him, at the stars above them, at the house where his daughter slept. Her answer when it came was barely a whisper, yes. He did not hear her correctly, at first, his mind unable to process the single syllable. What? Yes, 1,000 times yes, 1,000,000 times yes. She was laughing and crying simultaneously, reaching for him as he rose from his knee. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I want to build a life with you. Yes to everything, the oil stains and the dinosaurs and the small town dinners and all of it. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. They stood together on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, while the Montana stars wheeled overhead. Inside, Molly slept, dreaming perhaps of velociraptors or sapphires, or the family she was about to officially gain. In Seattle, Ashworth Technologies continued its operations, no longer dependent on her constant presence. In Walt's Diner, a betting pool was about to be won by someone who had guessed October. And here in this small town at the edge of the mountains, two people who had found each other, twice against impossible odds, held on to what they had built and refused to let go. You know, Sloan said eventually, Molly is going to be unbearable when she finds out. She's been planning our wedding since August. She has a Pinterest board. I've seen it. There are a lot of dinosaurs on that Pinterest board. She's lobbying for a velociraptor ice sculpture. Sloan laughed, the sound mixing with the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. We could do worse. They could do worse. They could do much, much worse than building a life that included dinosaur ice sculptures and 8-year-old wedding planners, and the particular kind of love that grows from roots sunk deep through adversity. The door behind them creaked open. Molly stood in the doorway, rubbing her eyes, her hair a tangled mess from the couch cushions. Why are you guys standing outside? It's cold. Sloan held up her hand, letting the porch light catch the sapphire. Molly's eyes went wide. You did it, Dad. You finally did it. The child launched herself at both of them, wrapping her arms around their legs, creating a tangled, three-person embrace. I told Walt you'd do it before Halloween. He owes me a milkshake. Gershit raised an eyebrow. You were in on the betting pool. Everyone was in on the betting pool. Mrs. Henderson lost $20. Molly looked up at Sloan with sudden seriousness. Does this mean I can call you Mom now? The question hung in the cold air. Sloan knelt down, bringing herself to Molly's eye level. You can call me whatever feels right to you, sweetheart. Mom Laney, hey you, I'll answer to anything. Molly considered this with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice weighing constitutional questions. I think I'll call you Mom, but also sometimes Laney for special occasions. That sounds perfect. They went inside together, the newly formed family, leaving the cold October night behind them. The stars continued their ancient dance overhead, indifferent to human drama, but witness to it nonetheless. In the morning, there would be phone calls to make Becca and Walt and Evelyn and countless others who had watched this story unfold. There would be planning and logistics and the 1,000 details that transformed an engagement into a marriage. But tonight, there was only this warmth and togetherness and the profound relief of finally, after so many years, being home. Sloan stayed awake long after Garrett and Molly had fallen asleep. She sat in the darkened living room, looking at the ring on her finger, marveling at the journey that had brought her here. She had been so many people in her 39 years. The unwanted child passed from foster home to foster home. The hungry student working 3 jobs to afford food. The driven entrepreneur building an empire from nothing. The cold CEO, feared and respected and utterly alone. And now somehow she was also this, a woman with a ring on her finger, and a child who called her mom, and a man who had driven through the night to stand beside her when everything was falling apart. The identities did not conflict, she realized. They coexisted, each one a facet of the whole. She could be Sloan Ashworth, leader of a billion-dollar company, and also Laney, the girl who had once believed no one would ever want her. She could be powerful and vulnerable, successful and humble, independent and deeply profoundly connected. The sun would rise in a few hours. There would be work to do. There was always work to do, and a wedding to plan and a life to continue building. But in this quiet moment suspended between the night and the morning, she allowed herself to simply be grateful. Grateful for a broken down car on a mountain road. Grateful for a man who stopped to help a stranger. Grateful for a smile that she had recognized across 15 years and 1,000 miles of separation. Grateful most of all for second chances. Outside, the first light of dawn began to touch the mountains, painting them gold and rose and purple. A new day was beginning in Willow Creek, Montana, in a small town at the edge of the world where a mechanic and a CEO had found their way back to each other and where a little girl would wake soon to discover that her family was finally complete. The story was not over. There would be challenges ahead, there always were. Corporate battles and family dynamics and the endless negotiations of two people learning to share a life. But the foundation was solid now, built on truth and tested by adversity. And when the hard times came, as they inevitably would, they would face them together. That was, after all, what families did.